Today is the day we are finally attempting the biggest resin pour I've ever heard of. 40 kilos of epoxy resin is going down all over this Lord of the Rings Wargaming board as we turn Osgiliath into a truly flooded city.
Over the past 10 years, I've been working on this Osgiliath Middle-earth mega board, and in the most recent years, we smashed up the old board and turned this into this. And the time has finally come for the absolute finishing touch, the final glorious detail to bring this flooded city to life. It is resin time, baby! Now, I've done a lot of setup work here to really sell this resin-flooded city street effect with buildings sinking into the river and whole portions of the riverbed collapsing away. So I think we can really achieve a good look, but before I bring the 35 kilos of resin near my beloved scenery, we need to do some safety tests. So I grabbed a whole bunch of materials, basically everything I've used to make the board so far, and knocked together a little mini riverbank, still mounting sheeting down onto a pine frame, just like I did to build the big board so we can test our gate methods. And then for the riverbank, I used a mix of that green structural polystyrene foam and orange detailed finish foam, and then also applied some of my adhesives into pools so I can test out how watertight and how safe and unreactive all of the ingredients in my build are going to be. We've got two adhesives at play here, the standard construction adhesive, or liquid nails as we call it here in Australia, and a new type of sealant that's designed to be used in the middle of a storm for sealing leaking water. The gate system around the edge of the river will be a seam of liquid nails, some foam core sheeting, and then a seam of this black storm sealant for 3 layers of resin protection. The sealant is not built for resin, but it will hopefully be great at stopping any scary leaks mid-pour. With this in mind, I got some of the parts painted just like the board and jumped into testing before giving it too much drying time to see just how the piece would hold up under duress. To fully test out our riverbank style, I threw down some fast-drying basing glue and then chucked some Grimdark City Rubble and City Rubble blend straight into the glue, and then it was time to start mixing our resin. Now, I've made a few water features over the years, but not for quite a long time. I always use epoxy resin as it's usually completely foam safe, unlike polyester resins, which literally dissolved my first Osgiliath riverbank the very first time I ever tried to make a river. And recently, the folks over at Barnes have developed a new type of epoxy resin called Megapore. This beast has a working life of 2 hours and a cure time of 24 hours, so there's heaps of time for bubbles to escape, and it's not going to set on me too quickly. Ages ago, I bought a 3.5 kilo kit to attempt the first build, and then Barnes, when they heard about the project, sent over a full 30 kilo kit, so we are armed to the teeth with epoxy resin. So a big thanks to the team over at Barnes. It's mixed in a 2-to-1 ratio by weight, so I smashed down some part A, half as much part B, mixed them together until they turn clear again after the two components combine, and then threw it down into part 1, and then mixed up a second batch. You'll notice that I've airbrushed the riverbank section just like our real river, and that's because I want to test some pigments and see how they look over that dark blue pattern, and I've got some proper resin pigments from Barnes that I had for an old project. This one is chocolate brown, but when I put it in, it was actually a lot redder than I was hoping, and when I threw it down over the blue, it did not get the river look I was going for, so I just added some acrylic blue and yellow to use a bit of color theory to give me some brown, and blended that in as well. It was at this point I realized I definitely had a leak in the gate for the red-brown compartment, which might seem small, but it's pretty much fatal if left unattended because of how long this resin stays runny for. A perfect test though for our storm sealant. I slapped that all over the place, and it was a complete failure. That is not going to stop resin from leaking. The hydrophobic nature of silicon-based sealants make them amazing at repelling water at a molecular level, but they're not doing much to resin beyond being a physical barrier, so when they're not fully dry, it's pretty much useless for us. With more leaks springing up all over the place on this test piece, I experimented a bit more with our clear pool by adding some blue, and that yielded some really promising results. I probably should have tried the blue-gray like our actual airbrush color, but we'll test that out as we start doing the real pour.
So the whole purpose of doing this test piece is to kind of put some of my fears to rest and test out a few of the different materials and methods to kind of really help my anxiety about throwing 30 kilos of resin down on the main boards. Unfortunately, it hasn't really done that. The good thing we have learned is I've had a bit of a play whacking in some acrylics. It does actually look pretty interesting. But the sealing and the leaks, which is what we're all here to see, right, is looking grim. The brownie red one has just leaked completely. There was obviously a hole in this wall, and it's just gone right out, and probably gonna have to go back to smashing on hot glue, which is the old school method for that. But we've also, since then, now got a leak somewhere out the corner here, which I don't really know where that's coming from, in the blue one. So everything's leaking, everything's kind of not working. I guess it's time to pour all 30 kilos of resin on the main board.
With the utter failure of the previous gate system, it's time for an upgrade to our dam wall approach. The last thing we need is a pesky ent or dog-themed siege weapon bursting it open. My first port of call is a full wraparound seam of painter's masking tape. This stuff is strong and non-porous, adhesive side down to the timber. Then where the edge of that tape meets the timber, a thick vein of Selly's liquid nails, which did show promising resin-repelling signs when it was actually cured properly. Then our foam board sheeting, which is mostly there for structural integrity than resin proofing, but it forces the adhesive into a thick gapless seal, and then 2 or 3 overlapping seams of hot glue around the base of the core board. One layer down entirely, then another over the lip of that first layer, and then a third layer along the top lip of the first layer next to the core board. Oh my goodness, so much hot glue. I then started panicking about resin seeping under the stonework of the board itself, so I decided to seal the entire riverbank with another seam of glue, this time our fast-drying basing glue, and then sprinkled in some more City Rubble base ready, and this just gives us another layer of protection, and to be honest, it looks better anyway. I should have always done it like that, with a bit of rubble coming off those edges. I also used this to cover up any of the screws that were showing in the water section from drilling down the board, as well as the centerline join on the second board, where I had to use 2 timber sheets instead of 1 large one. I sealed that down with isopropyl alcohol and Geek Gaming Matte Scenic Sealant, using a pipette this time to ensure maximum penetration of the substrate for a good seal, and then realized my design had like a massive flaw. With Larissa's help, she got me to lift the board up. We set about relining the entire inner structure of the timber frame beneath with construction adhesive. I worked out that if the resin got past the first layer of our defenses, the tape, it could potentially find micro cracks where our timber sheeting was mounted to the pine frame and leak to the inside of the board, just bypassing all of our defensive measures, which would not be ideal, but I think that's pretty good now. I added all of the same gate methods to our second board: tape, then liquid nails, then foam core, then hot glue, and yet more hot glue. And maybe, just maybe, we might be ready for resin.
So we're about 36 hours into this build journey now. I've done all of the gates across the boards and let them dry overnight as well, so that they've got a really strong bond between all 4 of those defensive mechanisms. But I'm still very nervous. It's a lot of resin to go down. My original plan was to just do a little seam around the edge and test for leaks, and maybe even let that cure before the big pour. But I, as definitely me, all by myself, have had an amazing idea. I'm putting epoxy resin down. Epoxy resin is the big 40 kilo pour. Why don't I seal the inside edges of the gates with epoxy resin, but not 24-hour pouring resin, 5-minute adhesive resin. It dries clear, it makes a little seam, it will completely go hard super fast, and then, once all the other resin's down on top, we're never gonna see a thing. And I definitely thought of this all by myself.
So yeah, a big shout out to Lukey from Geek Gaming, who called me at like 4 AM in the morning after I posted some work in progress photos to our Zorpazorp community Facebook group to scream at me for not making an inner seam lining with epoxy. So I grabbed 10 packets of 5-minute epoxy from Bunnings and started smashing it all over those edges. I tested it first to make sure that it was in fact clear and wasn't going to yellow, and then we're good to go. A real focus here is getting a lip of resin sliding up the tape. Obviously it's going to level back down, and then jamming it into all the nooks and crannies, especially our biggest weak points, which is the edges of the board, where the river gates join to the land. I was worried about how the hard lip of the meniscus is going to look, because I kind of intended to go back here and tease that down to make that sort of lump really flat and join with the board, but I sort of totally forgot about how fast it was going to dry. But anyway, we can't help it now. I grabbed my spirit level to make sure the boards were level, had to do a little bit of chalking to get it perfectly straight, and then it is finally time to pour some damn resin in the River Anduin. If you're enjoying the build so far, let me know down in the comments your favorite scene from the Two Towers, as we're almost coming up to that 20th anniversary, and then like the video and subscribe to go in the draw to win a bundle of Osgiliath themed goodies. Congratulations to Sean, who won the 3rd Battle Force with his diorama idea as the party at rest. I've actually been planning a little dio of the 3 travelers waking up in Woodhall and having breakfast after spending the night with Gildor and the Noldurin Exiles. There's still one more Battle Force to give away to Patreons and channel members, so hit the join button down below to double your chances. Also, remember to use my affiliate links down below whenever you're purchasing any hobby goodies, from Middle-earth to the Horus Heresy and everything in between. We've got affiliates in the US, EU, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and any purchase made through the links gets you fantastic prices and sends some dollary dues back to support Zorbazorb and all our shenanigans. We started strong with a fantastic yeet of the Part B tub spewing uncooked hardener all over the desk, and then reset and tried again a little more calmly on a flatter section of the table and mixed up our first sizable batch of epoxy resin. Nothing massive here, as we're just doing that little seam pour around the edges. I did, however, throw in some acrylic paint to start tinting it, this time using that blue-grey that originally went through the airbrush, and man, it just looks so much better. I started throwing this all around the edges, pushing it up to the tape to cover over the 5-minute epoxy and test out just how strong that seal really is. I had to be careful when pushing around that I didn't scratch the paintwork underneath, so I ended up using a nice soft piece of foam core. That was the way to go there, but I mixed up more and more batches, getting that seam all the way around the edge, and experimenting with different ratios of pigment as well, getting better and better results as it got darker and darker. I just thought I found a leak, but we're okay. It was just a spill on the table. So that is our baby pour done, and it's been about 10 minutes and there's no leak. So that means we've got no kind of catastrophic problems, no big holes that are being immediately exposed by the resin. Now I think what I'm gonna do is leave this about half an hour to an hour and just see if there's any tiny micro cracks that are gonna be a leak. If there's not, then we'll complete this layer so that it's one consistent skin of resin, very, very thin, only a couple of millimeters. So that way that, you know, as it starts to dry, there's no weird tidal marks through. That'll be another test of those joins. And then in about 8 to 12 hours after that, which we know from our test piece, which is somewhere behind me, that's when we start to get hardening. Then we'll do the big layer. I think this might be working. After throwing down that next layer of resin, I smoothed it into the seam resin with no trouble at all. This early in the curing process, it's all still very low viscosity. Then I started experimenting with some different blues and greys and blended that into these mid-regions, and with a little stippling and swooshing, that all joined together nicely too. Then about 16 hours later, that foundation was firm to the touch, and we officially have that base layer of about 3 millimeters down all over the board with no leaks. I'm absolutely flabbergasted. The epoxy resin seam has done some huge work for us. Now it was time to start mixing some bigger batches. Over this next phase of the mega pour, I worked in 3 to 4 kilo batches at a time to make sure that I was still getting really well mixed ingredients and the pigments as well, and that's kind of a handy size for the different layers I'm going to be doing, as you'll see. It feels pretty badass to be literally mixing buckets of epoxy resin to pour on the board at a time. I wanted to start going darker here to build up the depths of the river, so I added more blue and engine grey to our first batch and threw that down into our first board as a bit of a mid-tone. Then I mixed up a very desaturated and clear batch with a tiny bit of blue and a medium amount of grey to sort of soften the clarity a little, and then poured this into the shallows, finally spilling resin up and over the lower streets, submerging those cobblestones and also around the flooded parts of the tilting buildings. While I had this clear stuff out, I threw that down into the shallows of the second board around the riverbanks and over the submerged rubble. I just want to shout out my amazing Patreons. These incredible people are just a huge part of why any of these sorts of videos can happen. Huge congratulations to our winners from the Osgiliath livestream series who scored a couple of the new battle forces, and to become part of the family and support the channel, as well as going into the draw to win some sweet Osgiliath themed giveaways. Check out my Patreon down in the description, or simply hit the join button here on YouTube just down there next to subscribe. Then I wanted to make a darker batch for an even deeper section of the water, and here I made my first big error of the pour. I threw in some blue, and then I thought it would be nice to try out some black to get that darkness, and I kind of went off to the workshop for a minute or two to dig around for that paint, but I forgot to mix the blue first, and so that just sat on the top and created a bit of a skin, and then I came back and started mixing the black in without even sort of checking that it had dried on the surface, and all of that blue paint just became dry, large particles blasted through the resin, and they just would not dissolve no matter how much I mixed it in. Not wanting to throw out 3 kilos of resin, I just poured it in anyway, and it was actually much darker and required a lot of massaging to blend into the mid-tone, but over time it ended up looking really good, but the little bright blue flecks of paint were everywhere. Over the rest of the day, I was constantly fishing them out when I saw really large ones, and all the small ones will hopefully not get noticed under future layers of resin. To enable a high pour on the second board, I had to extend that masking tape layer all the way around the lip, which was a little bit scary, but oh well. And then I slapped in some of that dark stuff and then another mid-tone color to really start bringing up the overall height of that board, and I'm really enjoying where that water level is sitting in and around the submerged pieces of the city.
Pours had been going pretty well, but it's not the proper resin experience if we don't get a serious leak, right? This bad boy here, out the back, I kind of suspected this and I forgot to put a seam of glue up the back or something. I managed to sort of stop it here, but all that's done is shunt the resin down, and I'm up to like my 8th or 9th attempt at making a gate, and you can see, look at that right there, that is more resin on the table. So it's time to just try and save this leak.
I sealed the leak with some hot glue and some 5-minute epoxy, and hopefully that's going to hold over the next 24 to 48 hours. It was about 16 hours in when the first pour started going firm, so that's the really scary period, but it pretty much has to last that whole time to survive the pressure of the weight of the resin. So far though, I'm really happy with the look of the boards, and now it's just time for the nervous wait. If there's going to be any disaster monsoons of resin all over my garage floor, now is when it's going to happen. And I think that maybe the second board might be a little bit too blue, even for Peter Jackson's very blue Anduin, but I'm hoping that when the wave layer goes down on the top of this, that sort of desaturates it a little bit, but we shall see. In the meantime, cross your fingers for me, everyone, and I'll see you on the other side.